So in this video, we're going to talk about how to memorize scales. Now, I'm not saying that my way is the right way to do it or that it's the best way to do it. It's just how I do it. So hopefully it helps you. Now, you could just play them over and over and over again and try to remember them that way. And I'm sure you would eventually remember them, but I'm not really a fan of memorizing by rote usually, because if it's based only on repetition, then if you forget it, you're not going to have any way of recalling it. So I always find that it's a good idea to have a more methodical approach that's based on something you can figure out, even if you do forget. One good way is if you remember the key signatures of your scales, then you'll know which sharps and which flats to hit, and that would help you out. So for example, if it's a G major scale, and you know that G major has one F sharp, you could start on a G, and then play every single note as a natural until you get to F, play that as a sharp, and then you would have a G major scale. Now, I do like this method because you should know which sharps and which flats you have in each scale. That's something you should memorize, and I know that's still partly getting you to memorize by rote, which is something I just said that I don't like doing. But if you've been memorizing your scale since grade 1, and then you go on to grade 2, and then 3, and so on, then you're only really adding a few new ones per grade. And keys like D major, G major, A major, we actually play a lot on the violin because those are the keys that sound the best on the violin. So if you commit to trying to memorize all your keys, you're going to know all of them by the time you hit like grade 8 or 10, depending on whether you're in Canada or the UK. Now, for myself, the way I've always memorized my scales is just by memorizing the melody of each scale. That way, you're not memorizing every single scale with every single fingering pattern. Because each type of scale has its own melody, right? And therefore its own pattern. And that pattern is made up of whole tones, semitones, and other intervals depending on what you're playing. So if you play the pattern differently, it's just not going to sound like the scale you're trying to play. And I know that sounds super obvious, but I think that for students who have trouble memorizing their scales, they're just simply not thinking about their scales this way. They're trying to memorize the fingering itself, which really ups the workload because you literally have to memorize every single scale. Whereas if you remember the melody and the pattern itself, you just have to remember one pattern for that one scale. Let's take a major scale as an example, and we'll just look at one octave to keep it simple. In each octave, you have 8 notes. Let's number them from 1 to 8. 8 is equal to 1 since they're both the note of the key. I should probably also say that there are actually names for all the notes: tonic, supertonic, mediant, but I don't want you to have to memorize the names just to understand this video, so I'm just going to say first note, second note, etc. Now, the major scale is made up of whole tones and semitones. The third and fourth note and the seventh and eighth note of each major scale are semitones. I like to think of it practically that when you're playing, when your fingers have a gap, that's a whole tone, and when your fingers don't have a gap or they're close together, that's a semitone. Now, if you played those semitones and whole tones in any other spot than these ones, your major scale isn't going to sound like a major scale. So listen while you're playing, and when you can tell that the next note should be a semitone or should be a whole tone, you can adjust your fingering accordingly. Now, if you have trouble telling which notes should be whole tones and which should be semitones, then you should work a little bit more on your intervals, either by playing some whole tones and semitones on your violin or a piano, or just listening to other people playing scales and clocking where the whole tones and semitones are so you start to recognize them and can reproduce them. That's probably one of the most fundamental things you need to know when you're learning music, so that's just a good thing to practice anyway. So I hope that makes sense, using the melody of the scale to remember what the actual pattern is, and then using that to figure out where to put your fingers. Now, if you're confused about whether or not it's a semitone or a whole tone when you're crossing strings, I find that a simple way of figuring this out is if your fingers are in their normal positions, but you have to stretch your fourth finger high, then your high fourth finger and your next normal spot first finger is a semitone. Or if your fourth finger is in a normal position, but your first finger is on the next string in a low first finger position, then that's also a semitone. Now, once you've got the hang of this and you start playing 2 octave or even 3 octave scales, then you simply just start the pattern all over again once you get back to the tonic. That's when the 8th note of this octave becomes the first note of the next octave. You may find that if you're getting confused when adding octaves, it will be easier to play the long tonic version of the scales so that you always know where the first note of the pattern is. Or if you're doing RCM and in the lower grades, the tonic actually repeats anyway, so that's how you know the pattern is starting again. So hopefully that gives you a good guide as to how you can work on memorizing your scales if this is something that you struggle with. Now let's look at all the scales one at a time, and I'll try to give you some tips to make it even easier. So let's start with the major scale again. For this one, I find it easiest to think of the pattern in two groups of 4, because then it's just the same pattern twice, and the pattern is parallel because of the way our strings are set up in parallel fifths. So whatever finger pattern you're doing for the first 4 notes, it's the exact same pattern for the next 4, just one string up. Of course, this will look a bit different if you start shifting within an octave, but hopefully by the time you start learning how to shift, you'll know the scale patterns quite well and can follow the melody and pattern even if you do need to shift. Now, for the minor scales, I always find that it's easiest to think of the minors in terms of how they're different from the major. The most important note that is different in the minor scale pattern compared to the major scale is the third note. In the minor scale, the third note is lower and close to the second note instead. That's what makes a minor scale sound like a minor scale in all 3 types, whether it's a natural minor, harmonic minor, or melodic minor. If the third note of your scale is not close to the second note, then it would just sound like a major scale again. I was always taught that major scales sound happy, do, re, mi, and minor scales sound sad, do, re, mi. So that's an easy way to remember what the melody sounds like. It's also worth it to note that in all of the minor scales, the first 5 notes stay the same. It's only the 6th and 7th notes that change pattern between the different minor scales. So that gives you even less to have to memorize. For the harmonic minor, instead of being made up of just whole tones and semitones, there is an augmented second, which is essentially the size of 3 semitones, or what I just call the big gap. If you aim for your finger position to be a whole tone, then just add 1 more semitone, you've got your big gap. Again, like the major, it's probably easiest to think of this one in groups of 4. For the first 4 notes, just make sure your third is low, then for the last 4, it's 2 notes close together, and 2 notes close together with a big gap in the middle. I also find this melody easy to remember because the top 4 notes are used in Middle Eastern music, which should sound familiar. For the melodic minor, it's different going up and coming down, and it's the only scale that does this. On the way up, I just pretend that I'm playing a major scale, except that the third is low, so it sounds like a minor. Then on the way back down, the 7th and 6th note that sounded like a major scale both move down 1 semitone. If you think of it this way, it's a lot less complicated than it seems. I also like to keep my fingers down, and then you can literally just move those 2 notes down a semitone one at a time, so it's very clear where the notes live on the string. For arpeggios, they are only made up of 3 notes, the first, third, and 5th note of the scale. And they're the same 3 notes for both the major and minor arpeggios, except that, as we said before, the third note in a minor is 1 semitone lower than the major. So these should be the easiest ones to memorize. I would suggest that you actually try to memorize the notes themselves. My teacher would make me recite the triads so I knew which notes were in which key very well. If you don't know the notes, just think through it slowly at first, and you'll get faster the more you practice. So if you're starting on an A, skip the B, C, skip the D, E, A, C, E. This will help you not only when you're playing your arpeggios, but when you work on your music theory as well. You will also find it helpful when you move on to playing dominant 7ths. There's also a trick for remembering the fingering based on the intervals of the arpeggio. Because we're skipping notes, we're no longer dealing with whole tones and semitones, but now we have a third, and then a 4th. And the fingering for thirds is easy because you always just skip 1 finger. So if you start on a first finger, skip 2 is a 3, skip 4 is a 1, so it's just 1, 3, 1. If you're starting on a third finger, it's 3, 1, 3. If you're starting on a 0, it's 0, 2, 0, or 4th finger if you're doing 4 instead of 0. If you're starting on a 2, it's 2, 0, 2, or 2, 4, 2 if you're doing a 4. So hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here, which is what makes it so easy to remember. The fingerings are either all odd numbers or all even numbers. 1s are always followed by 3s and vice versa, and 0s or 4s are always followed by 2s and vice versa. And because the 1st and 5th note of the scale make a 5th, and your strings are in fifths, they're always the same finger exactly parallel across the strings, again, unless you need to shift within the octave. Then you just need to play the top note of the arpeggio and either come back down the way you came or continue the pattern again. When you get up to a grade where you have to shift, it's even easier. Anything that's an A flat and above, you could technically just play with 1-3-1, shift up to the next octave and go 1-3-1 and repeat. Play the top note and come back down. Now, if we look at dominant sevenths, they are basically arpeggios with one extra note, which is the seventh. Now remember that dominant sevenths do not start on the first note of the key like every other scale. Because the dominant is the fifth note of the key, we are starting on the fifth note. So if it's in D major, we start on A. If it's E major, we start on B, etc. If you find this difficult to figure out, remember that our strings are in fifths. So whatever key it is, find it on your string, go one string up on the same finger, and that's the dominant. And just like arpeggios, since all your notes are in thirds, the fingering pattern is the same. So if you're starting on 1, it's 1-3-1-3. If you're starting on 3, it's 3-1-3-1, etc. Then you need to play the top note to finish off the octave. So you play a D if you started on a D, for example, and then you just come back down. I also find it easy to play dominant sevenths by thinking about the first two notes as a major third and the second two as a minor third. So you've got one high group and one low group. And this should help you also when you move on to playing 2 and 3 octave dominant sevenths, when the 1-3-1-3 fingering pattern may no longer apply once you have to shift. Just remember that it's one major third and two minor thirds. For diminished sevenths, they can look really confusing, but every single interval is a minor third, including when you finish up the octave. So in a way, these are the easiest ones. If you use your finger positions to do a minor third, just count one whole tone and one semitone. That's a minor third. If you look on the fingering map as well, you'll see that the notes line up to be one semitone before the ones from the previous string, so use that if it helps you as well.
Just like dominant sevenths, diminished sevenths don't start on the note of the key. Instead, these ones start on the leading note, which is just one semitone below the key. So these ones are actually a lot easier to figure out where to start than dominant sevenths.
For chromatic scales, you really can just memorize the fingering pattern, which goes 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4 for every string. Then you simply start on whatever finger you're starting on and then continue the pattern. Just remember which note you're starting on and which note you're ending on at the top, and play every single note in between using this fingering pattern, and you've got your chromatic scale. Just remember that they're all semitones, don't do any gaps. If you're doing more than one octave, you can also count how many notes you're doing so you know when you're reaching the next octave. There are 12 notes in each octave, the 13th one being the beginning of the next octave, so playing 3 groups of 4 will help you keep track of where you are in the scale. Now we get to double stops. For thirds, it's actually basically the same fingering pattern as for arpeggios. If you're starting on a 3 on the bottom, the next one has to be a 1. If you're starting on a 2, the next has to be a 0. And I find that it's helpful for these if you remember the key, because it can get a bit confusing in the beginning to remember which bit of the scale is a major third or a minor third. So if you remember which ones are sharp or flat, then it will always work out. And the more you play these, the easier it will be to remember the melodic pattern. It might also be helpful to listen to the scales separately. The regular major scale is on the bottom, and the major scale starting on the third of the scales is on top. For sixths, it's very similar in that you can listen to the 2 melody lines to make sure you're playing the right scale, whether you're doing major, harmonic, or melodic, and you can also listen and familiarize yourself with the intervals of each double stop, as they will be either a major sixth or a minor sixth. For sixths, the normal scale will be on the top line rather than the bottom. I find sixths the easiest to remember in terms of fingering because whatever finger is on the bottom of the double stop, you just use one finger higher on the next string for the top note. Major sixths have a gap, whereas minor sixths have no gap. For octaves, there are only two possible fingerings, 0-3 or 1-4. The most important thing to focus on then, after making sure that your octaves are in tune, is remembering the major or minor melodies. Now, I find it easiest to practice with just using my 0 and first fingers first to make sure I'm playing the right scale before adding the top note. Artificial harmonics are almost exactly the same as octaves fingering-wise, and I would practice them the same way as well. As long as the bottom note, the 0 or the 1, are in tune, and your top note is in tune, then you should be able to play the scale according to its own melody pattern. So that's it. I hope that helps. If you have any questions or you want something clarified, just make a comment below and I'll try my best to help.